Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, as co-host of this event representing the Federal Foreign Office, I'm delighted that so many guests from all over the world are joining us today. This is a clear sign that experts consider the topic on our agenda both relevant and interesting. I'm particularly grateful to our distinguished panelists who are taking the time to share their expertise and experience with us. And I'm very pleased to welcome numerous representatives of governments and civil society, including think tanks and the scientific community. My special thanks go to the Counter Extremism Project, CEP Germany, that organized today's event. You may be interested to know, and it was mentioned already, that CEP Germany last month published a study commissioned by the Federal Foreign Office, shedding light on the transnational connectivity of violent right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism. This study is available on their website. It also takes a first look at the financing of right-wing organizations and actors in Finland, France, Germany, Sweden, the UK, and the US. Ladies and gentlemen, past experience has shown that right-wing terrorist attacks do not cost much. The Halle assassin used a 3D printer to print his own weapons, while the Charlottesville assassin drove his car into a crowd protesting against right-wing marches. The costs for both attacks were manageable. However, much greater funding is needed to draw people under the spell of right-wing ideologies. Money to run the propaganda machine, money to pay for organizing meetings. We need to know where this money comes from, where it goes, who uses it, and how, as well as what we can do to stop the cash flow. Regrettably, too little research has been done to date on the financial operations of the transnational violent right-wing extremist movement. All too often, the movement continues to be mistakenly viewed as a self-financing entity in poor financial shape. We cannot escape this conclusion when we see that it is not uncommon in Germany for meetings of right-wing extremists to be held on private land acquired for this purpose by inconspicuous actors of the right-wing extremist scene. Whereas the financial activities of the Islamist extremist milieu have been well scrutinized and thus exposed and better understood, more research is needed to further analyze the various online and offline financial activities of the transnational violent right-wing extremist movement, and to adequately account for the money circulating in this milieu. This lack of analysis might be attributed to the erroneous impression that violent right-wing extremist groups are mainly fueled by contributions or donations from their members, and therefore do not necessarily need further financial scrutiny. However, it seems that this assumption is only correct as far as individual perpetrators of attacks are concerned. They regularly self-finance their preparations and attacks. But it would be wrong to generalize this example as representing a typology for the overall financial operations of the wider transnational violent right-wing extremist movement. Furthermore, the aforementioned study demonstrated the lack of available raw data concerning the financial activities of violent right-wing extremist actors. And where these data do not exist, there is an analytical gap between the data and a structural understanding of the overall financial structure governing these activities. An international and cross-authority effort is needed to counteract the financial machinations of the extremist right-wing scene. Our conference today is an opportunity to take a closer look at how the extremist right-wing movement finances its activities. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that today's conference can serve as a starting point for closer cooperation between the participants which helps protect our democracies from the corrosive influence of right-wing extremism and terrorism by hindering its financial activities on all levels. I wish you now an interesting conference, and I look forward to presentations and discussions which are both exciting and thought-provoking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heinze. I really appreciate it. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Kristin Mørkestøl from the Ministry of Justice of Norway, one of the other co-sponsors of the event. Kristin Mørkestøl is the head of the section for national security in the police department in the Norwegian Ministry of Justice and Public Security. Her section is responsible for policies relating to preventing and countering violent extremism, amongst other issues. Prior to her current position, Ms. Mørkestøl served 13 years in the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, working on a broad range of security issues to include civil-military cooperation, international cooperation, and cyber policy. She has worked in academia on related topics as well. Mrs. Mørkestøl has extensive international experience as she has lived and studied in Italy, France, and Belgium over several years. Ms. Mørkestøl, I'm very much looking forward to your statement. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schindler. Thank you for the floor. Distinguished colleagues, on behalf of the Norwegian government, I am proud to be co-hosting this side event today on a very important topic, a topic which is high also on the Norwegian agenda. In the last few years, several incidents across the world demonstrate that the threat from right-wing terrorism and extremism is present in many countries. Right-wing terrorist attacks show that it is not sufficient to focus only on extreme Islamism. We also need to pay attention to violent right-wing movements. In Norway, we place high importance on preventing and combating all forms of radicalization and violent extremism, involving partners across the government. So efforts to combat the financing of terrorism is a key part of this work. This summer, the Norwegian government published a strategy on combating terror financing, and we also revised a 9-ministry action plan against radicalization and violent extremism. And at the moment, the Ministry of Justice and Public Security is heading the work to develop a national counter-terrorism strategy in Norway. So the terrorist threat from right-wing extremism is also present in Norway. The 2 terrorist attacks Norway has suffered during this century were both carried out by persons motivated by right-wing ideas. I believe my fellow Norwegian colleague, Cato, will say more about this later today. These attacks in Norway were in fact carried out and self-financed by lone actors, so they also do exist. Although the terrorists were both influenced by right-wing movements and other terrorists, their misdeeds were not facilitated economically by others. However, we have not, even if we in Norway have not yet seen examples of right-wing terrorists financed by supporters or facilitators, this does not mean it will not happen in the future, and it does not exclude the risk that such financing may involve Norway in some way. Hence, increased knowledge about how right-wing extremism are funded is something we very much welcome. Legally banning right-wing groups is challenging, although some countries are now seeking ways to ban the most extreme and violent organizations. Likewise, detecting suspicious transactions and ultimately prosecuting the financing of right-wing extremism may also prove to be difficult. However, increased attention to and knowledge about right-wing individuals and groups amongst financial intelligence units and reporting entities is necessary. In this, also research and academic contributions may prove very useful. We also need increased information sharing. Police, security services are key actors alongside the mentioned financial intelligence units, as well as the private sector. So to succeed in ensuring greater safety for our citizens, we need broad cooperation, both within and between our countries. Our common goal must be that all forms of terrorism, to include right-wing extremism, are prevented from raising funds to commit terror. We look forward to today's discussion and to following the development of this important work. So with that, thank you very much, and back to you, Hans Jakob.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mørkestøl. I appreciate it. It's an honor that the Norwegian government decided to co-sponsor this event, and we will indeed look into the financial activities of Anders Breivik's and the reasons for the timing of this attack, which is connected to his financial activities. So it should be quite an interesting presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Christopher Heinze from the US State Department. As you may know, the State Department has also agreed to co-sponsor this event. Chris Heinze is the Deputy Coordinator for Countering Violent Extremism. In this capacity, he is responsible for developing and implementing strategies to counter terrorist messaging and recruitment, including the terrorist misuse of the internet. Chris also oversees terrorist detention policy. Prior to his appointment to the Bureau of Counterterrorism, Mr. Heinze served as the Director for Transnational Threats and the Director for Afghanistan at the National Security Council. A Virginia native, he returned to the area following several years in Silicon Valley, where he served as a strategic sourcing and operations product development manager at Apple. Before this time in the private sector, Chris worked in the public policy and defense areas. From 2011 to 12, he served as an Army intelligence officer on NATO's Counter-Corruption Task Force in Afghanistan. Previous to that, Chris worked on the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researched and wrote about Al-Qaeda's emerging safe havens, focusing especially on those in Yemen and Somalia. Chris served on the staff of Vice President Dick Cheney. Chris earned his BA in International Studies from Middlebury College and an MBA and MA in International Relations from Yale University. He has published pieces on foreign policy in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and National Review Online. And he has appeared as a guest analyst on various public panels and television and radio broadcasts. Recently, he has worked on initiatives aimed at bridging the civil-military divide, including co-chairing the Veterans Summit at Yale University. Chris is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Heinze, a pleasure and an honor to have you here today. The floor is all yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Hans. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Counter Extremism Project for co-hosting, or pardon me, for hosting this event. And thanks to our fellow co-sponsors, Germany, Norway, and the UK. And of course, thank you to our distinguished speakers and panelists. The United States is committed to pursuing a comprehensive and sustained approach to address the threat of racially or ethnically motivated terrorism, or REMT for short. Working closely with our international partners, part of this comprehensive approach requires that we deepen our understanding of how REMT groups and individuals finance their activities and identify the appropriate tools to address this aspect of the challenge. And I was very heartened to hear that CEP and the German federal government have worked on a project that focuses just on that. And I look forward to reading that report on CEP's webpage soon. While we realize there is no consensus on nomenclature for this problem set, we urge all parties to be as precise as possible when labeling the threat. For the US, the term REMT refers to attacks perpetrated by individuals or groups motivated to commit violence in the name of defending against perceived threats to their racial or ethnic identity. White supremacist terrorism is a particularly virulent subset of REMT. The individuals and groups engaging in racially or ethnically motivated attacks attempt to sow fear among their target communities and ignite a wider conflict. They seek to intimidate and coerce their victims to advance their political goals. Some high-profile attacks that occurred in the last few years indicate growing international connectivity among REMT actors, particularly through online communities. A disturbing trend among REMT actors is that some are traveling or have traveled overseas to train and gain combat experience in regional conflicts. As with ISIS-inspired foreign terrorist fighters, these REMT foreign terrorist fighters will pose a great threat to our communities when they return home and have the perceived credibility needed to recruit, organize, or carry out attacks. For our part, the United States State Department is leveraging the full range of our counterterrorism tools to counter the transnational aspect of the REMT threat, including using our sanctions tools, diplomatic engagement, using public diplomacy to counter message and delegitimize REMT ideologies, working to deny REMT actors safe spaces online, and capacity building. In April, the United States designated the Russian imperial movement and 3 of its leaders as specially designated global terrorists. This was the first time the State Department imposed such a designation on a white supremacist terrorist organization. The department determined that the Russian imperial movement provided training for acts of terrorism, including at 2 training facilities in St. Petersburg, where 2 Swedish nationals received training before going on to commit a series of terrorist attacks in Sweden targeting migrants and refugees. In addition to disruption, public designations can expose and isolate these individuals and organizations, deter would-be supporters, and force these groups to expend time and resources to find new sources of revenue and channels for moving these funds. I'd like to highlight some of our key observations about how REMT groups and networks are financing their activities. I'm sure we'll hear more about this throughout the course of the event. We see that these groups are funded from a variety of licit and illicit sources. They have a track record of selling music and merchandise on e-commerce sites, including some that we have all used. They also raise money through membership fees, concert tickets, and donations. Some have succeeded in using popular crowdsourcing sites, but as more mainstream online payment sites have denied service to known white supremacists, individuals and groups have migrated toward explicitly extremist crowdfunding platforms. And of course, like most terrorist groups, they generate revenue through criminal activity, such as selling counterfeit goods, drugs, and weapons, and through the provision of military-style training. When it comes to moving funds, REMT groups tend to use the regulated financial system, such as banks and money transmitters, to move funds both domestically and internationally. There's also growing interest among groups in using virtual currency to solicit donations and move funds. While many attacks are self-funded, certain measures can assist in developing information to identify and disrupt attacks. For example, public-private information sharing forums can be useful to sharing threat-specific information on particular groups or individuals. Additionally, certain contextual indicators developed to identify possible activity by other terrorist organizations may be useful for helping financial institutions identify similar patterns of behavior. I'd also like to commend Germany for using their presidency of the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, to highlight this challenge. The FATF is currently working on a project being co-chaired by Germany and the United States on how REMT individuals and groups raise, move, and use funds with the goal of enhancing public and private sector understanding of this threat. As I conclude, I want to reiterate the importance of governments, civil society, communities, and the private sector working together to counter REMT. Combating this threat will take collective effort. None of us can defeat it alone. We must remain committed to regular, routine information sharing between and among all stakeholders about threats and tactics, and to incorporating public-private collaboration into our overall preparedness efforts. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and look forward to learning from their experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Heinze, for your statement, which really was a wonderful summary of what we are about to address during today's event. I really appreciate it. It's fantastic to have you with us today. It is now my distinct honor to introduce Mr. Kingsley Green from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, the 4th co-sponsor of this event. Mr. Green is currently the head of the UK's Counter Terrorism and Extremism Network in Europe. Prior to joining the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Mr. Green worked in the Office of Security and Counterterrorism in the Home Office. In that position, he specialized in protect and prepare, the 2 strands of contest, the UK's counterterrorism strategy, initially focused on specializing CBRNE capability, and then as head of the Borders and Aviation Unit. Before moving to work in the counterterrorism policy, Mr. Green spent 10 years as an intelligence professional in the Defence Intelligence in the UK Ministry of Defence, including postings as a liaison officer in Ottawa and Baghdad. During his time in Defence Intelligence, he worked across a range of portfolios, including support to military operations, counter-proliferation, and counter-terrorism during a secondment to the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, JTAC. Before joining the civil service, Mr. Green studied international relations at St. Andrews University, where he also worked as a researcher at the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. Mr. Green, it's an honor to have you with us today. The screen is all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Schindler, and thank you to all the participants and to CEP for arranging and hosting this event. I'm really proud to be a co-host alongside colleagues from Germany, the US and Norway. The UK is committed to tackling the threat from right-wing terrorism, both domestically and internationally. In the UK, we have seen the scale of the right-wing threat steadily increase. As some of you will know, in June 2017, Darren Osborne attacked worshippers outside Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, killing one and injuring 9 others. Since then, nearly a third of the disrupted terrorist plots in the UK have been inspired by right-wing ideologies. And more recently, in the 12 months to April 2020, 20% of the CT-related arrests in the UK were linked to suspected right-wing terrorism. This highlights why the UK government is taking the right-wing threat so seriously, and why the whole of the CT community has a role to play in tackling it. We've been working hard to ensure that our domestic counter-terrorism response and approach is effective against right-wing terrorism. And I just want to flag 2 policy areas which we think are particularly relevant. Firstly, prevention, which remains a cornerstone of our approach and is critical in this space. The UK programme, a lot of you will know it as Prevent, seeks to tackle the causes of radicalisation, safeguard those at risk, and respond to the ideological challenge of terrorism in all its forms, including right-wing terrorism. This is the area that Mr. Heinze pointed out, where we want to prevent people from falling under the spell of right-wing ideologies. And to do that, we have to counter the propaganda and material that radicalises that is out there. Secondly, prescription, which my colleague Mr. Harnish mentioned in the US context, which the UK government considers an effective tool for disrupting right-wing groups. It sends a strong message that terrorist groups are not tolerated in the UK and deters them from operating here by establishing a range of criminal offences. Since December 2016, the UK has proscribed 3 right-wing terrorist groups: National Action, Sonnenkrieg Division and Führerkrieg Division, the last of which has members across North America and Europe. However, as we've heard, this threat is a transnational one, and it is important that the international community works together to address it. This applies to activity online, the international networks of individuals, and importantly for this event, the financing of violent extremist groups and individuals. We need to build a shared understanding of these financial networks. And this should include an understanding of the similarities and differences between right-wing and Islamist terrorist financing. The latter has driven a lot of our counter-terrorist financing approaches in the past. And then building on that, we can assess the effectiveness of our current approaches and where we might need to change and adapt. To that end, I'm really looking forward to the input of the panelists today and the subsequent discussion. As you would expect, the UK counter-terrorism finance strategy focuses on reducing terrorist fundraising in the UK, reducing the movement of terrorist finance in and out of the UK, and reducing the fundraising and movement of terrorist finance overseas. This is all predicated on strong international cooperation. I'd like to thank all the participants attending this event today and the experts who will present their research. It is important that we recognise the role terrorist finance plays in the right-wing sphere, and we look forward to working with all of you to tackle this growing threat and to ensure that our multilateral responses are able to address the evolving nature of terrorism. Thanks very much.